Blood in My Eye by Comrade George L. Jackson. To the black communist youth, to their fathers, we will now criticize the unjust with the weapon. My dear only surviving son, I went to Mount Vernon, August 7th, 1971, to visit the gravesite of my heart, your keepers murdered in cold disregard for life. His grave was supposed to be behind your grandfathers and grandmothers, but I couldn't find it. There was no marker, just mowed grass, the story of our past. I sent the keeper a blank check for a headstone and 2 extra sites, blood in my eye. Preface. In his introduction to George Jackson's Soledad brother, Jean Genet wrote, "Nothing has been willed, written, or composed for the sake of a book. It is both a weapon of liberation and a poem of love. This book too is a weapon, but one entirely willed and purposeful. It was completed barely a week before the author's murder in San Quentin on August 21, 1971. It was sent out of the Adjustment Center with specific instructions for its publication, almost as if the author knew that he would never live to see its appearance in print." Describing it a few days before the end, George said, "I'm not a writer, but all of it's me, the way I want it, the way I see it." What he saw and what he wanted, the central passion of his life, was war, the revolutionary war of the people against their oppressors, a war which grew out of perfect love and perfect hate. "I've been in rebellion all my life," he wrote in one of his letters. For a young black growing up in the ghetto, the first rebellion is always crime. George's first experience with American law came at 14 when he was arrested in Chicago for stealing a purse. From then on, his life was a constant succession of arrests, juvenile homes, paroles, and more arrests. At age 18, he was convicted of stealing $70 from a gas station. His lawyer promised him that he would make a deal with the DA if George confessed to second-degree robbery. He told George it was his only chance because he had a record. "Don't put the court to the expense of a trial, and they will give you county time." Instead, he was given an indeterminate sentence, 1 year to life. "The first time I was put in prison, it was just like dying. Just to exist at all calls for some very heavy psychic adjustment. Being captured was the first of my fears. It may have been an acquired characteristic, built up over centuries of black bondage. The turning point in his life came when I met Marx, Lenin, Trotsky, Engels, and Mao, and they redeemed me. For the first 4 years, I studied nothing but economics and military ideas. I met the black guerrillas, George Big Jake Lewis, and James Carr, W.C. Nolan, Bill Christmas, Tony Gibson, and many others. We attempted to transform the black criminal mentality into a black revolutionary mentality. He wasn't alone in his discovery. At the same time, other prisoners were just beginning to discover Marx, Fanon, and Mao, who provided them with a new way of regarding themselves and their struggle, a new standard of moral judgment. "I have been in rebellion all my life. I just didn't know it." The social insights of Marx and others made it possible for them to have a sense of themselves as members of the human community, members of a revolutionary brotherhood. In prison, commitment to revolution has a special meaning and a special price. To be identified as a revolutionary by the prison authorities means an almost permanent denial of parole, separation from the other prisoners, solitary confinement, usually in maximum security wings of the prison. transfers from one prison to another, beatings, bad food. It brings down on you the entire punitive and repressive force of a completely totalitarian system. Inside prison, George practiced a very special kind of devotion and love. When convicts talk about him, they often use the term "for real." Many inmates murder mouth and sell wolf tickets. They do a lot of heavy talking, but when it comes down to the point of action, they disappear. George, however, was as good as his word. Whenever he made a statement of some kind, it would be followed by action. If you were the victim of a racial attack inside prison, there was a good chance that he would turn up fighting for you at your side. Most of his offences inside prison, the reason why he was forced to spend over 7 years in various forms of solitary confinement, including the infamous strip cells in Soledad's O Wing, the reasons why he was never paroled involve his defense of other inmates. What made him particularly dangerous to the other prison authorities was this enormous talent as an organizer. We have got to be together. We have got to be in a position to tell the pig that if he doesn't serve the food when it's warm and pass out the scouring powder on time, everybody on the tier is going to throw something at him. Then things will change and life will be easier. You don't get that kind of unity when you're fighting with each other. I'm always telling the brothers that some of those whites are willing to work with us against the pigs. All they got to do is stop talking honky. When the races start fighting, all you have is one maniac group against another. That's just what the pigs want. It is not coincidental that the need for unity among revolutionary groups is one of the major themes of this book. Try to remember how you felt at the most depressing moment of your life, the moment of your deepest dejection. That is how I feel all the time. No matter what level my consciousness may be, asleep, awake, in between, the thing is there, and it keeps me moving, pins my eye to the ball, uptight, 24 hours a day. Locked down inside his cell, George devoted himself to study. His painfully acquired scholarship in the fields of Marxian economics and history rivaled that of most college professors. But sometimes, for days on end, reality itself would vanish from his cell. I would be sitting in a special locked isolation cell, sometimes even with the lock welded shut, and there would be no one to talk to, just the sound of screaming voices. And because there is no human contact, you depend on books, no contact with people, special lock welded on the door, nobody around. I'm strictly by myself. The only friend I had was a book. Sometimes I'd find myself talking out loud to the author. I'd sort of wake myself up and I'd hear myself talking to this other person. I guess it was like some kind of wish fulfillment. When I'm asleep at night, I still find myself talking to those guys. Typing laboriously on a plastic typewriter, George published position papers which dealt with prison life and revolutionary politics from a Marxian point of view. He paid a heavy price for his activities. When the prison couldn't break him through solitary confinement, they attempted to have him killed by other inmates. They were forced to frame me and set me up for the final kill. The word was out among white convicts. Get Jackson, it will do you some good. Once he remarked that there had been 20 setups on his life inside prison. It got so that when he left his cell, he was always ready to parry an attack. But nothing could mitigate the pain of confinement, and the years stretched out and a whole decade passed. In the context of his life, what happened next had a grim inevitability. On January 13, 1970, a new exercise yard was opened in the maximum security wing of Soledad Prison. 8 whites and 7 blacks were skin searched and sent out into the yard. Predictably, a fight broke out between the whites and the blacks. Without any warning, a tower guard who had a reputation as a crack shot began to fire. He fired 4 times and 3 black inmates were killed. 1 white prisoner was wounded in the groin by a shot that ricocheted. Black survivors claimed that one of the wounded men bled to death on the concrete floor. 3 days later, the Monterey County grand jury found that the killings were justifiable homicide. Less than half an hour after this verdict was announced on the prison radio, a white guard, not the guard who had fired the shots, was found beaten to death. All the convicts in the wing where the killing took place were put into isolation. On February 28, Fleeta Drumgo, John Clutchett, and George Jackson were formally charged with the murder. The prison authorities accused George because, in their words, he was the only one who could have done it. With their total power over the inmate population, the power of parole, solitary confinement, the power of life and death, they were certain they could get the kind of testimony they needed when the trial came. When George's parents came to visit him, they used to bring his younger brother Jonathan. George and Jonathan would get off to one side of the visiting room and whisper together. What went on between them can be seen in this book in the excerpts from Jonathan's correspondence. At the age of 16, Jonathan had an extraordinary insight into the nature of guerrilla warfare. In some of his letters, George was later to refer to Jonathan as his alter ego. After George was accused of the murder of the guard on the 16th of January, Jonathan began to get his first taste of American justice. Jonathan himself wrote, "People have said that I am obsessed with my brother's case and the movement in general. A person that was close to me once said that my life was too wrapped up in my brother's case and that I wasn't cheerful enough for her. It's true I don't laugh very much anymore. I have but one question to ask all you people and people that think like you. What would you do if it was your brother?" On August 7, 1971, Jonathan Jackson entered a courtroom in San Rafael, California, and attempted to free 3 black convicts, one of whom was on trial for assaulting a guard. He armed the convicts and took 5 hostages, including the assistant district attorney and the judge, still dressed in his robes. He died a few minutes later in a hail of bullets inside a rented car that was being used for the getaway. "We're taking over," he said. At 17, Jonathan had already come to the conclusion that the only way he could affirm his sense of justice was at the point of a gun. His experience of life in America had convinced him that the only way he could be heard was by an act of suicidal daring. "You can take our pictures. We are the revolutionaries." With these words, he announced to the world that he was not a criminal because he no longer recognized the legitimacy of white law. When his sister heard the news of his death, she cried out, "But he was only a boy." Her mother corrected her, "Don't say that. He was a man. They killed his father a long time ago. Jonathan wasn't going to let that happen to him. He was going to live like a man." After his death, George wrote in a letter, "I haven't shed one tear. I'm too proud for that. A beautiful, beautiful man-child with a submachine gun. He knew how to be with people. I loved Jonathan, but his death only sharpens my fighting spirit. I'm proud just to have known that he was flesh of my flesh, blood of my blood." In a news conference 3 days after, he said, "I loved that boy. I was the first to stand him up in his crib. Not a crib really. All we had was a box. I taught him how to walk. I wanted to teach him how to fly. I think of him now as I think of Che Guevara." George's last book, Blood in My Eye, speaks with the voice of the dead. Not only the dead George Jackson and his brother Jonathan, but the living dead in all of the jails and ghettos of this country. It speaks with the voices of the men who have already given themselves up for dead and who have nothing left to give except a death for the people. It is very much a book by a man who considered himself doomed. In his last letters, George wrote about the judicial process as the endgame. He had foreseen and foretold his assassination at San Quentin 1,000 times. 10 years of blocking knife thrusts and the pick handles of sadistic pigs. The fact that the author of this book lived with his death for so many years gives his book a kind of special importance, but it would be a mistake to consider it simply as the work of an individual. George always refused to consider himself an individual. Untold thousands, both inside and outside prison, join in its proclamation of total revolutionary war. This book was written literally in bedlam, with the author locked in solitary for a minimum of 23.5 hours a day, in the midst of raucous screaming that never stopped, the screams of prisoners being beaten, the screams of men retreating from intolerable pain into madness. It is a book about taking the revolution that George worked and died for inside prison out into society at large. His message to his revolutionary brothers is crystal clear. Settle your quarrels. Come together. Understand the reality of our situation. Understand that fascism is already here. That people are dying who could be saved. That generations more will die or live poor, butchered half lives if you fail to act. Do what must be done. Discover your humanity and your love in revolution. Pass the torch. Join us. Give up your life for the people. George was shot and killed inside San Quentin on August 21, 1971. The convicts who were with him inside the cell block where he was being confined have asserted that he sacrificed his own life to save them from an official massacre. This would only have been in keeping with the character of his entire life. Gregory Armstrong, October 15, 1971.